262 feet of painted steel rise over the Brooklyn shoreline at West 29th Street, rigged with cables and towers built for a ride that has not operated since Labor Day of 1968. It is called the Parachute Jump, and in the years it functioned, roughly 2 million riders were hauled to the top and dropped in a controlled 12-second fall. For the 58 years since, the structure has done nothing but stand there. It is floodlit every night in rotating color, landmarked in 1989 by the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission, inspected on a regular schedule, and repainted at a cost that has run into the millions of dollars, all to preserve a machine that will never again do the one thing it was built to do. It was not even built here. It went up first at the 1939 World's Fair in Flushing Meadows, was disassembled and moved to Coney Island in 1941 by a company that hoped lightning would strike twice, and for a while it did, until the mechanism failed and the money to fix it never arrived at the same time as the will. Coney Island kept the frame and lost the fall. That, in one structure, is the whole story of the peninsula. Every chapter of this story follows the same pattern. Something saves Coney Island. That thing makes it rich, and then that same thing becomes the force that hollows it out. A 5-cent subway fare saved it in 1920 by putting more people within arm's reach of its sand than any beach in the country. That same nickel and the open door it represented meant that nothing here ever had to earn loyalty. It only ever had to be close. Coney Island was never supposed to be a town. It was a strip of barrier sand the city never zoned for permanent life, a machine designed to fill every summer and empty every autumn. And for the better part of a century it did exactly that, on schedule, without complaint. Then, one year, it emptied out in October, the way it always had, and it did not fill back up the following May in the same numbers, and nobody who ran the place could say, with any real precision, whose job it had been to make sure that it did. The sand under Coney Island is roughly 20,000 years old, laid down at the edge of a glacier that reached its farthest point across what is now Brooklyn and Long Island during the last ice age, then retreated and left behind the ridge of gravel and rubble known as the terminal moraine, with the outwash sand pushed south of it forming a low barrier spit facing the open Atlantic. For most of the time, humans have known this coastline. Nobody wanted it, for much of anything. The Canarsie band of the Lenape people fished its creeks and dug for clams along its flats for at least several thousand years before any European ship reached the harbor, leaving behind shell middens that archaeologists would later excavate along the shoreline, and are recorded as having called a stretch of this shoreline Narioch, a name some translations have rendered as land without shadows, referring to its flat, treeless, south-facing exposure, though the precise translation is debated among linguists working from incomplete colonial-era records. Henry Hudson's crew sailed past it in September of 1609 without landing, and the Dutch who came after named the marshy outcropping Coney Island, or Rabbit Island, after the wild rabbits that infested its dune grass, a name the English later flattened into Coney. For roughly 200 years after that, almost nobody built here on purpose. The land flooded in storms, bred mosquitoes by the billion in its salt marsh, and offered no fresh water and no farmland worth clearing. It was a place people passed on the way to somewhere else. In 1829, a group of Manhattan investors built the Coney Island House, a modest hotel meant to draw wealthy guests out from the city for sea air, but reaching it meant a long carriage ride down rutted roads through Gravesend and Flatbush, or a small boat crossing subject to weather. Either way, most of a day spent traveling for an afternoon at the shore, and for the next 3 decades, the hotel drew only a trickle of visitors willing to make that trip. Farmers in the surrounding towns considered the barrier spit itself close to worthless, fit only for grazing a few sheep on its dune grass, and sold off marsh parcels for a few dollars, an acre to anyone willing to pay the taxes on land that flooded twice a year and grew nothing worth harvesting. That indifference did not survive the 19th century. The first man to treat this shoreline as an asset rather than an obstacle was William A. Engeman, a former Union blockade runner turned speculator, who in 1868 quietly purchased roughly 40 acres at the eastern end of the island for a price recorded at close to $10,000, or something in the neighborhood of $200,000 of today's dollars, land that at the time produced nothing and supported nobody. Engeman had heard, before most of his neighbors had, that a rail spur was being planned to reach the shore, and he wrote the acquisition, so that any future rail concession serving his stretch of beach would have to answer to him first. He built a modest bathing pavilion, then a hotel, and the crowds that the rail line eventually delivered made the value of that sand multiply almost overnight. His success drew a harder man behind him. Austin Corbin, the railroad financier who would go on to control the Long Island Railroad itself, built the far grander Manhattan Beach Hotel next door in 1877, and, within 2 years, made national headlines by publicly announcing he intended to keep Jewish guests out of his resort entirely, a piece of Gilded Age bigotry that put Coney Island's name in newspapers as far away as Chicago and London, for reasons that had nothing to do with sand or surf. Corbin's Manhattan Beach Hotel, when it opened, could sleep several hundred guests at a time and was built at a cost estimated in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, several million in today's terms, and its guest ledgers from the period are said to have included Ulysses S. Grant, several years removed from the presidency by then, entertained there as one of the resort's marquee visitors in a season when Corbin was still courting exactly the kind of respectable moneyed clientele he intended to keep exclusive. The land, it turned out, was not just valuable. It was contested from the very first transaction over who got to stand on it. It took one more man to turn that contested sand into an industry, and his name was George Cornelius Tilyou. He was born in Brooklyn in 1862, the son of a china and glassware shop owner who also cut hair on the side, and he grew up literally on Coney Island's Boardwalk, running souvenir concessions and selling bottled sand and seashells to day trippers as a boy, before he had any money of his own to speak of. By his 20s, he had made a small fortune developing lots along Surf Avenue, and in 1893 he traveled to the Chicago World's Fair, where he rode the original Ferris wheel and returned home determined to build something similarly astonishing on his own turf. In 1897, he opened Steeplechase Park, the first fully enclosed single-admission amusement park in the country, built around a mechanical horse race ride that gave the park its name and its logo, a leering, wide-toothed cartoon face that became one of the most recognizable trademarks in American entertainment. A single ticket, priced at a quarter in the park's early years, bought entry to dozens of attractions at once, including the human roulette wheel, a spinning disc that flung riders toward its padded edges in front of a paying gallery of onlookers, and the Barrel of Love, a rotating wooden drum that made strangers stumble into each other's arms, both rides built less around thrills than around the specific embarrassment of being watched. A formula Tilyou understood better than any of his competitors. Tilyou was, by every contemporary account, a shrewd and occasionally ruthless promoter. When his park's glass dome pavilion of fun burned to the ground in 1907, he is reported to have set up a table at the smoking ruins the very next morning and charged paying customers 10 cents apiece to view the wreckage, under a hand-lettered sign reading, roughly, that he had had troubles before and could stand this one too, and that admission to the ruins would cost a dime, though the exact wording of that sign has been repeated in so many versions across so many decades that it may be legend rather than documented fact. He rebuilt within a year, this time enclosing the new Pavilion of Fun behind a quarter-mile of glass and steel, said to be the largest glass-enclosed structure on the East Coast outside a railroad terminal, so that the park could keep operating regardless of weather. By the time he died of a heart attack in 1914, at 51, Tilyou had built an amusement fortune worth an estimated several $1,000,000, a figure that would translate to tens of millions today, and control of the park passed to his widow Mary, and then to his son Edward, who kept Steeplechase running largely unchanged for another 50 years, adding few new rides and updating little on the theory that a formula which had already worked for 2 generations did not need reinventing. Tilyou had done it by understanding something his competitors were slower to grasp, that the ride itself mattered less than the feeling of being safely terrified in front of a crowd of strangers a rider would never see again. What Tilyou started, the subway finished. In 1920, the Sea Beach and Culver rail lines connecting Coney Island to Manhattan were folded into the new city subway system at a flat fare of 5 cents, the same nickel it cost to ride anywhere else in New York, and the effect on attendance was immediate and staggering. On the hottest Sundays of the 1920s, contemporary press accounts put the number of people on Coney Island's beach and boardwalk at close to 1 million in a single day, a density of humanity per acre of sand that no other beach in the country came close to matching, then or since. The Wonder Wheel opened in 1920 at a construction cost of roughly $300,000, or somewhere near $4.5 million in today's money, and the Cyclone roller coaster followed in 1927 at a cost of about $175,000, close to $3 million today, both financed on the confident assumption that the nickel fare would keep delivering customers indefinitely. In 1916, a Polish immigrant named Nathan Handwerker had opened a hot dog stand on Surf Avenue selling francs for 5 cents apiece, half the going rate, undercutting his former employer. A German restaurateur named Charles Feltman, who is generally credited with having first served a sausage inside a sliced roll on Coney Island back in 1867. And by the 1920s, Nathan's Famous was selling tens of thousands of hot dogs on a single summer weekend. While Feltman's original restaurant, unable to match the nickel price, spent the rest of the century in a slow decline of its own. Behind the beach itself, an entire rooming house economy grew up to catch the overflow crowd that could not make the last train home. Blocks of boarding houses, bathhouses, and short-term hotels, renting beds by the night to families who wanted a full weekend rather than a single day. A business that depended entirely on the same subway crowds and would collapse the moment those crowds stopped needing a place to sleep it off. By the middle of the decade, newspapers had taken to calling the whole stretch the Nickel Empire. a name that stuck precisely because it captured how completely one 5-cent fare had come to explain the size, the wealth, and eventually the fragility of everything built on top of it. At its commercial high point in the mid-1920s, contemporary surveys counted well over 1,000 individual concessions, rides, games, and food stands packed into little more than a square mile of sand and boardwalk frontage, a density of small businesses per acre that few commercial districts anywhere in the country could match, all of it dependent on the same crowds arriving through the same handful of subway exits every weekend. The entire economic model rested on volume so enormous that nobody had to ask whether any individual customer would ever come back, because 1 million more were already getting off the train behind them. What happens next to this economy is the part almost nobody remembers, and it is the reason the amusement district existed in the form it did for as long as it did. If any of this is new to you, subscribe to the channel before we go on. At its peak, in the years just before and after the Second World War, Coney Island smelled like frying oil, boiling corn, and salt air all at once, and the boardwalk at dusk carried the specific noise of 100 competing barkers, a calliope organ, and surf underneath it all. The Engeman Boardwalk itself, a wooden promenade completed in 1923 and stretching close to 3 miles, had been built specifically to give the beach a formal spine, lined on its landward side with bathhouses like Ravenhall and Silver's, where a family without a car could rent a locker and a bathing suit for the day for a dime or two, change out of city clothes, and spend 8 hours in the water and sand for less than the price of a movie. Families rode the subway out from every borough carrying blankets and shoe boxes packed with sandwiches, because the beach itself was free even when everything on it was not, and for many of them, a single day at Coney Island, hot dog, ride tickets, and subway fare included, cost less than $1 for an entire family well into the 1940s. Steeplechase Park still ran its mechanical horses and its blowhole theater, where a jet of compressed air lifted women's skirts in front of a laughing audience seated in bleachers built for exactly that purpose. The sideshow performers of what was known as Dreamland Circus Sideshow, and later sideshows by the seashore, pulled crowds with sword swallowers, fire eaters, and a rotating cast of self-described human oddities. A few blocks off the boardwalk stood the Half Moon Hotel, a 14-story oceanfront tower that had opened in 1927 catering to respectable vacationing families, and which became notorious in an entirely different way in November of 1941, when a small-time mob informant being held there under police guard, ahead of testimony that threatened to implicate senior organized crime figures, went out a 6th-floor window to his death, under circumstances the department never fully explained, a single bizarre footnote that had nothing to do with amusement rides and everything to do with how ordinary Coney Island's oceanfront geography had become to the rest of the city's business, legal and otherwise. Nathan's hot dog stand, the Thunderbolt and Tornado coasters, and the boardwalk arcades with their skee-ball lanes and fortune-telling machines all operated within a few blocks of one another, drawing Italian, Irish, Jewish, and black working-class New Yorkers in numbers and combinations rarely seen together anywhere else in mid-century America. People were born within sight of the parachute jump, married in churches a few blocks off the boardwalk, and buried from funeral homes on Mermaid Avenue, having spent entire lives believing, reasonably, that all of it was permanent. Here's the thing about Coney Island at its peak that deserves to be said plainly because it explains everything that came after. The entire economy of the place depended on a single narrow proposition, that a 5-cent, later a 10-cent, subway fare would always be the cheapest and easiest way for a working New Yorker to reach open water and a day of organized fun. Nothing about that proposition required Coney Island itself to be good or well-kept or safe or improving, because it only had to remain the closest and cheapest option available to millions of people who had few others. The land underneath it made the flaw worse. Nearly all of the amusement district sat on small, individually owned lots, hundreds of separate deeds carved out over decades of speculation, which meant that no single owner, however wealthy, could ever coordinate a comprehensive rebuild or a coordinated response to competition, only a patchwork of individual decisions made block by block and season by season. You can look at attendance figures from any decade of the boom and never once find a discussion, anywhere in city planning records, of what would happen to this economy the day a faster road, a cheaper car, or a farther beach became available to the same working-class families the subway had delivered for free. That flaw sat in plain sight for 60 years before anything came along to expose it. The exposure came in pieces, and each piece looked at the time survivable. On May 27, 1911, a fire believed to have started in the Hellgate ride at Dreamland, the most architecturally ambitious of Coney Island's 3 major parks, spread through its plaster and lath towers so fast that firefighters could not save any of it, and among the chaos, a lion named Black Prince escaped from the park's menagerie and was shot dead on Surf Avenue by a park employee, before it could reach the crowds fleeing the blaze. A detail contemporary papers reported with the same flat astonishment reserved for the fire's roughly $4 million cost, something over $100 million in today's terms. Dreamland was never rebuilt as a unified park. Its site was carved up and sold in pieces over the following decade. On September 21st, 1938, the hurricane later known as the Long Island Express came ashore with almost no warning and tore out sections of the boardwalk and several bathhouses, a storm surge that the National Weather Service would later estimate killed more than 50 people across the wider region. Though Coney Island itself, protected somewhat by its position, absorbed structural losses rather than a comparable death toll. It was repaired within a season because the summer crowds were still arriving on schedule and the economics of rebuilding still made sense against that guaranteed volume. In between these disasters, in 1929, the state opened Jones Beach State Park farther out on Long Island. A vast, meticulously landscaped public beach, reachable only by car along parkways that Robert Moses had deliberately designed with low bridge clearances to keep buses, and by extension the poorer New Yorkers who depended on them, from reaching it easily, a project that gave the growing number of car-owning families an alternative shoreline for the first time, and quietly ended Coney Island's decades-long monopoly on cheap, accessible ocean recreation. Then, on August 12, 1944, a fire tore through Luna Park, the second of the three great parks, destroying most of its Moorish towers and minarets in a single night. The park limped forward at reduced scale for 2 more seasons before its owners closed it for good in 1946, and its remaining structures were leveled by 1949. A decade later, on August 31st, 1954, Hurricane Carol tore into the northeast coastline and again stripped sections of the boardwalk and its railings back to bare pilings, damaged the city patched over the following spring largely out of habit rather than confidence, since attendance figures by then had already begun a slower decline that no single storm had caused. Ride operators along the boardwalk had grown used to totaling storm damage in the low tens of thousands of dollars per event, a manageable line item against a season that could still bring in many times that amount, which is part of why nobody treated any single storm as a turning point. Until, looking back decades later, it became obvious that several of them in sequence had been. Throughout the late 1940s and into the 1950s, periodic outbreaks of polio in the city triggered public health warnings that specifically named crowded public beaches and swimming pools as sites of concern, and attendance on the worst of those summers dipped in a way older residents remembered decades later. An odd, invisible disaster with no fire and no flood, just empty stretches of sand on days that should have been packed. Each of these blows on its own had been absorbed, rebuilt around, and forgotten within a season or two because the crowds kept coming back and the math of rebuilding kept working. Every fire, every storm, every strange, quiet summer had been survivable. The next decision would not be. Steeplechase Park, the last of Coney Island's original 3 amusement parks still standing, closed for good on September 20th, 1964, after its owners concluded that declining attendance no longer justified the cost of running it. And the following year, the vacant site was purchased by the Trump Organization, then run by Fred Trump, for a reported $2.5 million, with public plans to eventually build high-rise housing on the property. In the summer of 1966, while the city's zoning boards were still debating what could legally replace an amusement park on that stretch of oceanfront, Trump staged a publicity event at the shuttered Pavilion of Fun, inviting reporters, local officials, and a small crowd of onlookers to pick up bricks and hurl them through the building's ornate stained glass windows, smashing the last physical remnant of Tilyou's original park in front of the cameras before any demolition permit made it strictly necessary. The residential towers, Trump promised, were delayed for decades by zoning fights and financing problems, and the Steeplechase site sat as a fenced, empty lot for years afterward, home to nothing but weeds and a chain-link perimeter, a piece of oceanfront real estate that had been an amusement park for 67 years and would not host another paying customer of any kind for a generation. It would take until 2001, 35 years after the bricks went through the windows, for the city to finally put the land to use again, building a minor league baseball stadium, now known as Maimonides Park, on a portion of the old footprint, a modest ballpark standing where a quarter-mile of glass once enclosed the largest indoor amusement pavilion on the eastern seaboard. The transaction was, on paper, a reasonable one, a declining asset sold to a buyer with capital and a development plan. What it produced in the years immediately following was an empty lot at the heart of what had been the busiest amusement strip in the country. They left, not all at once. Some families had lived within a few blocks of the boardwalk for 2 generations and did not go easily, holding on through the late 1960s, even as storefront after storefront along Surf Avenue and the Bowery went dark for good. But steadily, relentlessly, the way water leaves a broken vessel, the year-round population of the amusement district thinned out through the 1970s, as the small bungalow colonies and rooming houses that had once housed a summer population many times The neighborhood's official count were cleared under urban renewal plans pushed by city planner Robert Moses, replaced with high-rise public housing towers that held fewer total residents and none of the seasonal boarding house economy the old buildings had supported. Where the summer population of the amusement district had once swelled into the tens of thousands packed into rooming houses, hotels, and rented rooms, the post-war towers housed a fraction of that number year-round, a ratio of roughly 10 summer visitors for every one new permanent resident, and the arcades, bathhouses, and boarding houses that had depended on the larger number simply had no customers left to serve. The pattern accelerated through the 1970s as the city's own fiscal crisis cut back on policing, sanitation, and maintenance across every outer borough neighborhood, and Coney Island, already thinned out and increasingly associated in the press with rising street crime and the heroin epidemic then spreading through New York's poorer districts, saw many of the middle-class families who could afford to leave do exactly that, part of the same wave of white flight reshaping neighborhoods across the city at the time, while the residents who stayed were disproportionately those with the fewest other housing options. Boarded storefronts along the Bowery sat with their painted signs still legible, price lists for hot dogs and rides still posted in windows nobody had washed in years, furniture and fixtures left inside empty buildings, as though the owners had stepped out for the afternoon and simply never returned. What they left behind did not stay standing for long. What followed was not preservation, but liquidation. The old Luna Park site, vacant since the 1946 closure and cleared by 1949, was sold to the city and became the footprint for the Luna Park houses, a public housing development, erasing the last physical trace of the park's Moorish towers for a fraction of what the original construction had cost to build. Ride mechanisms, carousel horses, and carved facade pieces from the shuttered parks were sold off in scattered lots through the 1950s and 1960s, some for scrap metal prices, to collectors in smaller regional parks that could use working parts nobody in Brooklyn wanted anymore. And more than one former ride operator spent a weekend personally unbolting machinery from a ride he had run for 20 years, so a buyer's truck could haul it away for a few $100s. The old Dreamland footprint, subdivided and resold in pieces since the 1911 fire, had by mid-century become parking lots and low commercial buildings. Oceanfront land that had briefly housed the most architecturally ambitious amusement park in the country, now valued for the square footage of asphalt it could offer to day trippers' cars. The Half Moon Hotel itself, the same tower where the informant had fallen to his death decades earlier, closed and stood vacant for years before it was finally torn down in 1996 to make way for a senior housing complex, its ocean view rooms reduced to rubble hauled away for landfill. When Astroland finally closed in 2008, decades after the original three parks were gone, many of its remaining rides and signage were sold at public auction. Its iconic rocket-shaped entrance sign among the pieces bought up by collectors in smaller parks as far away as other states, scattering the last physical inventory of Coney Island's amusement era to buyers who valued it more as memorabilia than as working equipment. Not everyone left, not everything was sold off. In 1983, Denos Vorderis, a Greek immigrant who had run a hot dog stand nearby since the 1960s, bought the aging Wonder Wheel outright rather than let it be sold for scrap or redevelopment. And his family has operated it continuously since, eventually securing its designation as an official New York City landmark in 1989, a status that legally protects it from the kind of demolition that claimed Steeplechase's pavilion. Astroland, a smaller amusement park built partly on reclaimed Dreamland adjacent land in 1962 by the Albert family, kept a working amusement district alive on a reduced footprint for the next 46 years, even as attendance never again approached its mid-century peak, before finally closing in 2008, after its land was sold to a development firm for a price that, adjusted for what the original Dreamland parcel had once represented at the height of the boom, amounted to a small fraction of the district's former value per square foot. Dick Zigan, a playwright who arrived in Coney Island in the early 1980s, founded the nonprofit Coney Island USA in 1980, and 3 years later launched the Mermaid Parade, betting correctly that what visitors actually wanted from Coney Island was not another modern ride competing with theme parks in Florida, but the specific, slightly seedy sideshow and boardwalk identity the place had always had, a bet that turned sideshows by the seashore into one of the last continuously operating links to the freak show tradition Tilyou himself had profited from a century earlier. In 2004, local historian Charles Denson founded the Coney Island History Project, cataloging photographs, ride mechanisms, and oral histories from residents who remembered the amusement district's mid-century peak, work that fed directly into a community fight against a 2009 city rezoning plan that would have replaced most of the remaining amusement-zoned land with hotels and residential towers, a fight the preservationists mostly won, keeping a smaller but legally protected amusement district intact, rather than letting it be sold off entirely as Steeplechase's site once was. Each of these survivors shared the same insight. That Coney Island's value was never really in keeping pace with newer parks, but in being unmistakably permanently itself. Drive down Surf Avenue today and you pass a landscape that reads like 3 different centuries stacked on top of one another. The 1927 Cyclone still runs, landmark since 1988. Its wooden frame rattling riders the same way it did their grandparents. Nathan's original stand still sells hot dogs a few dozen yards from where handworker first undercut his old employer. And each July 4th, its eating contest draws a television audience many times larger than the neighborhood's actual population on any other day of the year. A new Luna Park, unrelated to the original beyond the borrowed name, opened in 2010 on a portion of the old amusement footprint. Its modern steel coasters rising a few blocks from a parachute jump that gives no rides, while Totano's, a coal oven pizzeria that first opened on Neptune Avenue in 1924, still bakes pies a short walk from the boardwalk. One of the very few businesses on this list of names old enough to have served both the Nickel Empire crowds and whoever gets off the train today. The year-round population of the surrounding Coney Island neighborhood today numbers in the low tens of thousands, and median home values along its edges run a fraction of comparable oceanfront property elsewhere in the 5 boroughs. Precisely because so much of the surrounding land is public housing built to solve a problem that no longer exists in the form it once did. A subway ride out from Manhattan today costs $2.90, nearly 60 times the nickel fare that built the place, though it remains, as it always has, the single cheapest way to reach an ocean beach from anywhere in New York City. In late afternoon, when the light comes in low and gold off the water, the boardwalk fills for an hour or two with people who came for exactly the reason their great-grandparents did, before it empties again, on schedule, the way it has every evening for more than a century. The parachute jump still stands at West 29th Street, floodlit every night in colors that shift on a programmed loop, inspected, insured, and maintained at public expense, for a function it has not performed since 1968. Tourists still photograph it from the boardwalk the same way their grandparents once photographed each other waiting in line to ride it, the structure itself now doing the entire job that the ride, the fall, and the crowd once did together. It gives no rides, drops no one, and earns its keep now purely as a silhouette, a landmark whose entire remaining purpose is to be photographed rather than ridden. Coney Island kept the frame. It has been trying, in one form or another, to get back the fall ever since.